Adesso l'ordine del giorno reca.
So the next item on the agenda is a statement by the Vice President of the Commission and the High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy regarding the situation in Venezuela. Good evening, Commissioner. I'll give the floor then to Mr. Stylianidis on behalf of the Commission and representing the High Representative for Foreign Affairs. Go ahead, you have the floor.
Mr. President, honourable members of the European Parliament, I'm here with you today on behalf of the High Representative Federica Mogherini. Recent events in Venezuela, the arrest and detention of Caracas mayor and veteran opposition leader Antonio Ledesma last week, and reports of alleged intimidation and mistreatment of Leopoldo López and other imprisoned opposition leaders and students who participated in last year's protests are unacceptable. 2015 is an electoral year in Venezuela with legislative elections due in the second semester. It is important for the European Union and the international community to be as supportive as possible of the country's democratic process and institutions. But the counterpart is that we will expect in an electoral year every effort to be made by the government in power to show that upholding the principles of democracy is a priority in the run-up to elections. The government should have confidence in the wisdom of the electorate to assess their performance and vote accordingly. Likewise, the people of Venezuela should be able to have confidence that the forthcoming elections will take place in a fair and transparent manner. In this context, the imprisonment of political figures and opposition leaders, as well as the restrictive environment for the media, are truly regrettable. We have already conveyed our concern about the continuing polarization of views and the multiplication of violent incidents in the country. We have called for the government, opposition leaders, students and Venezuelan civil society to work together to engage in peaceful dialogue and reject violence and overcome the situation. It's worrying that much needed reconciliation has made no progress. It is fully in the power of the government to take the first steps to de-escalate the current political polarization, ease the situation, reach out and enable dialogue to take place. We will continue to monitor closely the cases of the opposition politicians as well as students indicted at the same time, and we renew our appeal for full respect of the principle of presumptions of innocence and due legal process. If accusations cannot be evidence, those detained should be released without delay. We are well aware that Venezuela is confronted not only by political challenges but also by very serious economic, social and security problems. These include spiraling inflation. According to the Central Bank of Venezuela, general inflation had reached 68.5% by December last year, and inflation in food products is over 100%. There are increasing shortage of basic goods, rising social tensions and record levels of crime and insecurity. The severe drop in global oil prices will produce further difficulties and will challenge the ability of the state to meet its 2015 targets. Against this backdrop, we warmly welcome the recent renewed offers by Venezuela's regional partners, such as UNASU, to facilitate talks. We appreciate the important role Venezuela has played in contributing to regional integration. It has the potential to contribute to regional growth and prosperity. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll now open the debate. And first of all, the floor goes to the political groups. On behalf of the EPP, Mr. De Grandes Pascual, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, President. I would also like to thank the Commission Vice President. His words were brave, and I would repeat the word he used to describe what is happening in Mexico: unacceptable. Once again, very sadly, the European Parliament has to turn its attention to Venezuela. We have seen that Leopoldo López has been in jail for a year. Hundreds of opposition leaders and students share his fate. Protesters are being beaten. The mayor of Caracas, Antonio Ledesma, has been thrown in jail. This is unacceptable. We need to raise our voices once again. With all due respect for the people of Venezuela, we need to criticize the behavior of President Maduro. We need to look at what happened to the MP, Julio Borges. The next step might be to see Ms. Machada also thrown in jail. The communications, the press around the world are concerned about what is happening in Venezuela. We saw a student was killed, shot down. This was predictable. And the government is looking to blame the opposition for this death that was reported around the world. There are plenty of indications that President Maduro sees the spectre of a coup d'etat everywhere. He is afraid in the run-up to the elections. We would call on Venezuela's neighbors and other friends to prevent and fight against the developments there. There has been abuse and infringement of democratic rights and freedoms, individual and collective freedoms. They are in jeopardy in a great and much-loved country that is Venezuela. We need to show resolve and keep an eye on developments. I would call on all to observe the following: Antonio Ledesma, Leopoldo López, they must be freed. We need to ensure parliamentary immunity of Julio Borges is respected. President Maduro, the whole world is watching you, watching how you behave. I hope that you can understand that you must live up to the expectations of the great people you represent. You must play by the rules of the game. You must respect the popular will of the people as expressed in the upcoming elections. Thank you very much.
Thank you. On behalf of the Socialists and Democrats, Mr. Francisco Assis for 3 minutes.
Thank you, President. Vice President of the Commission, colleagues. Once again, we've received some very worrying news from Venezuela. The political crisis there has become drastically more acute in recent days. We must regret the fact that a teenager, 14 years, in the town of San Cristobal died in unclear circumstances yesterday, apparently having been shot by a policeman. Clashes between pro-government and opposition forces are worryingly close to what may be a point of no return. We need a calm, constructive assessment of the situation, because the situation amongst Venezuelans is potentially a dangerous point of tension within Latin America. A democratically elected government must stick to the election timetable as planned by the end of this year, and the opposition must continue to defend its own alternative project within the constitutional framework in total respect of democratic rules. We're well aware that the situation in Venezuela is a complex one. We would recall that during the course of demonstrations in 2013, during which 43 people were killed, talks were launched between the government and the opposition, but the opposition, which was split between moderates and more radical forces, which then abandoned the talks. But we must vehemently condemn the means being used to put down opposition by the government, which run counter to a proper democratic respect and the right for an opposition to exist. There have been serious violations of human rights, which have been forcefully condemned by the UN, Human Rights Watch, and more recently by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. Venezuela has obligations which it must respect with this in regard to this. Then the way the security forces have repressed demonstrators has led to a number of policemen and soldiers being charged, and yet the government authorised the use of live fire against demonstrators in January. They accused the mayor of Venezuela, as well as Leopoldo López, for supposedly preparing a coup. They suggested they were trying to take power by undemocratic means. You can't reach that conclusion if you look at the documents. And we can't have all these unfounded conspiracy theories being bandied about under the pressure of imperialism in the United States. That won't help the situation either. The situation is serious, and if we're to find a solution to it, all political forces need to work together under the auspices of the UN and regional organisations. But the European Union, and this Parliament in particular, must also make its voice heard. And Parliament must shoulder its full responsibilities, finding the most appropriate means with the greatest possible consensus we can to solve this very serious issue in a country which has been a great friend of Europe, in Venezuela.
Thank you. On behalf of the ECR, Mr. Tannock for 1 minute.
President, 2 days ago, Cariba Roa was just a young 14-year-old Venezuelan boy from the city of San Cristobal. Yesterday, while protesting against a corrupt government and a worsening economy, he was brutally shot dead by the police, and my condolences go to his family. President Maduro had the audacity last year to blame the deaths of 43 protesters on hatred of the government, and last week unjustly arrested the mayor of Caracas, Antonio Ledesma, charging him with plotting to overthrow the government, and there are several other opposition politicians also jailed for similar reasons. The people of Venezuela and the media are being oppressed by Maduro's government. Their basic human rights are being impinged on. The European Union does have a duty to stand up for Venezuelan democracy, or what's left of it. The rise of the far-left Chavismo model, based on the rotten, discredited Cuban Castro communist dictatorship model, is a threat, in my view and my group's, to the whole of Latin America. Thank you.
Grazie.
Thank you. And now Mr. Maura Barandiaran for 2 minutes on behalf of ALDE.
Thank you, President. In December, the plenary in Strasbourg approved an urgency resolution on Venezuela. It didn't amount to much. We'll approve another resolution next month. The Chavez regime, headed up by Maduro, is adopting ever more extreme attitudes. We have seen Ms. Machado suffer, Antonio Ledesma and Leopoldo Lopez likewise. The mayor of Caracas was thrown in jail, accused of orchestrating a coup d'etat, and then we saw a young protester gunned down. We need to be firm and tough. We need to go beyond deeds, or words rather. We need to speak out against this regime that cracks down on its own people. Unfortunately and continuously, Venezuela is suffering as a result of poor politics and economic inefficiency. It doesn't have money to buy the basics. People are struggling, so all the Venezuelan government has left is repression as it struggles with rising crime. All those indicators make it clear that Venezuela is moving towards civil conflict. Europe needs to raise its voice. It must adopt sanctions that would force the government in Venezuela to change tack. I would call for a genuinely joint position to be adopted by the European Union in respect of Venezuela. We need sanctions if the government does not change its attitude. I am afraid, my dear colleagues, that time is running out. If we wish to see the situation improve and not become irreversible.
Thank you. On behalf of the GUI, Mr. Kelzel Permui for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. I'm surprised that there's this obsession on human rights in Venezuela. And strangely enough, this always arises in election years. The Venezuelan government won internationally monitored elections. And now we're seeing attempts by the right, which is far out as you can get, to overthrow a legitimately elected government. In 2014, there was the exit program where there were paramilitaries and armed students, and people were killed. The government, under UNISOR auspices, organised a dialogue. None of you supported that attempt to generate dialogue and reduce tension. And then there was a so-called Jericho operation in December, and a coup plot which would have taken over the media and some institutions. And when Antonio Ledesma was arrested with no violence involved, you had a proper judicial warrant. Well, stop interfering, because the foreign ministers of Brazil, Ecuador and Colombia in UNISOR have been working together with President Maduro. In the elections, you can try and obtain something that you could never get by means of violence.
On behalf of the Greens, Mr. Urtasun for 2 minutes.
Thank you. Nobody likes to see the attitude that was shown to the mayor of Caracas. We have seen an escalation in the situation, serious accusations levelled against Mr. Ledesma. He was accused of organising a coup. His fundamental rights should be respected. Now, in Venezuela, violence has increased because part of the opposition claims that it can change the government through street protests rather than elections through the ballot box. As the UNISOR's Secretary General's communication indicated, the Exits currently being examined must be democratic, peaceful and appropriate in line with the Constitution and laws in force in Venezuela. I have a question for the Parliament. Would we be in a position to make a useful contribution, or are we just going to launch a general criticism of the country as was done in the last resolution adopted by Parliament? I think that what we can do is support UNISOR in its task, bringing together various neighbouring countries over the next few days. I hope that we can make a useful contribution and support UNISOR. In March we have two options. Either we can launch a general criticism, or we can support those that are trying to ease the situation in Venezuela. Thank you.
Thank you. Now give the floor to Mr. Castaldo on behalf of the EFDD for 1 minute and a half. Thank you, President. I'd like to say to colleagues quite frankly that the crisis in Venezuela doesn't seem to be one of the greatest geopolitical crises. Now, unfortunately, it's at the level of Ukraine. But it's no mystery that in the last 15 years, Russia and Venezuela have signed 200 economic agreements. 37 of them are in force. And China is investing hugely in the country. So, with this in mind, the fall of the price of oil to $50 a barrel is a coup de grace. However, today it's not clear why that's happened, and we don't know if it's happening autonomously. Now, instead of thinking very seriously of our role in the EU and bringing about greater escalation, now I think that we should instead try to defend the peace and act as a mediator, because either we speak too much or we're silent. Now, unfortunately, we've seen the death of the young boy today. We need to show common sense and wait and see what the public prosecutor do. What, unfortunately, the media is distorted and abused. Now, we're keeping the bar high. We shouldn't allow any infringement of human rights. We condemn what's happening in a sovereign state. We're not going to be bought off with the excuses that they're given. Now, we hope that there can soon be free elections and that it will be political and not violent, because we don't want the assassination to become simply another assassination of Francisco Ferdinando, and we believe that the Latin American country is important in mediation. Thank you. Now, Mr. Epitidios for 1 minute on behalf of the non-attached.
Thank you, President. Recently, on the 19th of February, the mayor of Caracas, Antonio Ledesma, was arrested. For having opposed Mr. Maduro. There was no warrant for his arrest, and he wasn't formally charged. This case, as was only to be expected, has raised awareness in international opinion, and the same applies to the leader of Golden Dawn, the third largest party in Greece, who, together with other party members, was illegally, unfairly imprisoned. President, colleagues, it's fine to say we're opposed to any violation of human rights anywhere, but it's hypocritical to adopt these partial positions on these topics. It would be much fairer, you'd be far more convincing in terms of political awareness if you could persuade Greece to bring an end to this situation which dishonours Greece and the Parliament.
Mr. Brok for 3 minutes.
Facoltà.
President.
President, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, Venezuela is a rich country, potentially one of the richest countries, but it has an erroneous economic system financing dictators around the world. Now, the country has been run down into the ground. There's high levels of corruption, and there's an economic crisis, a high rate of inflation and a chronic lack of basic commodities. Now, this is what usually happens with this kind of socialism, to develop conspiracy theories with the bad gringos in the north, and then conspiracies about mayors. It's the typical way to use propaganda and conspiracy theories to distract from what's happening, to put opponents in prison, to occupy the media, to take up all the airwaves speaking, and then to try to crack down on the judges and magistrates. We've seen this kind of thing again and again with similar systems, with Chavez, with Gaddafi, Tehran. Free Cuba was being celebrated as a model for the world. It was then financed, and we've seen the consequences for the people. And I think this is a classic example, and it shows very clearly that this kind of socialism simply doesn't work. People are thrown into prison. People say then that demonstrations are an attack against freedom and attempted coups against governments. Now, what happens in Spain if there are protests? Well, the situation in Spain is fantastic with respect to what's going on in Venezuela. And I think we have to realize that with what's going on, all we can say is that the left wing thinks that they can get rid of democracy. They've failed, though, haven't they? This kind of socialism has failed. And I think we've got to show very clearly that these methods don't work. Now, in December, I had a discussion with Mrs. Lopez here. I have seen now Antonio Ledesma being imprisoned, and others as well. When I look at what's happening in the prisons, I think it's an unacceptable dictatorship that is claiming to be socialist, but if it doesn't reach its objectives, it uses violence to silence democracy. But democracy is a value, very important value. You cannot simply put it to one side just because you think you have the upper hand and the better truth. This is an example of the left, the undemocratic left, that it's simply not the path that we can support because it's against the rights of men and women. It's not an example for us. Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Brock, there's a blue card for you. Will you accept it? On behalf of Mrs. Valina, 50 seconds.
You mentioned Spain. Well, what is happening in Spain? If you read the last UN report, you will have seen that Spain was criticized for recent legal reforms that forced any trade unionists and opposition members into jail. So as President or Chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, you should be familiar with the facts on the ground in my country when you speak of it.
Thank you, Mr. Brock. 50 seconds. Now, I know that Spain is coming out of a huge crisis. It's faced and has faced major channels. I know there's a free press and free media in Spain, and that the opposition is not being cracked down on. There's free competition there. I know that, and people are not simply being thrown into jail. But a comparison with European democracy with a dictatorship in Latin America is simply unacceptable for the person who put the question, who simply hasn't understood what parliamentary democracy actually means. Now, the people who put those questions simply didn't understand it, but Joseph Stalin onwards kept doing the same thing, and it seems some people are sticking to that ideology. Thank you. Now, Mrs. Valenciano, for 2.5 minutes.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, President. I have no general opposition to Venezuela, but I also want to defend Democrats, all Democrats in Venezuela. And with all due respect for the citizens and institutions of that country, I think we have to say today that we are concerned by the situation this country, which is so dear to our hearts, is going through. Not just the most recent news regarding the death of a 14-year-old teenager in a demonstration, there's also the arrest of the mayor of Caracas. I believe that has exceeded the limits of respect for an elected office. Respecting democratically elected officials from various parties is possible of a normal democracy and protected by the rule of law. To be a democratic country, it's not just enough to win elections, you also need to respect the opposition, and you must protect citizens who agree with the opposition's positions. Political parties and associations ought to be able to work freely in a democratic system, and you cannot treat political leaders as criminals, which is what has been done with a number of opposition leaders in Venezuela. Polarization and generating tension will not help solve the country's problems. In saying this, I'm not conspiring against Venezuela, far from it. As far as I'm concerned, I'm acting in defense of my friends, the people of Venezuela. Nor are we threatening sovereign governments. We believe that all public officials in Venezuela should build a real democratic space, because that's going to be the only way to tackle the problems which Venezuela faces. If you have a mayor elected by citizens, he holds an office that has to be protected. I don't know whether there are political prisoners as such in Venezuela. What I can say is that a large number of politicians have been imprisoned. There's no denying that. Now, I think I can speak on behalf of the vast majority of my colleagues in this House in saying that we must call for the mayor of Venezuela and other politicians who have been arrested to be released, as recommended by the Group on Arbitrary Detentions of the United Nations some months ago, as did the Commission of Human Rights of the Americas. It has to be stated that you cannot have politicians being held in military camps. That's incompatible with democracy. I also think the European Union must join in with all Venezuelan Democrats to create a real framework for dialogue which will allow democracy to develop in Venezuela.
Muchas gracias. A teraz proszę o zabranie głosu.
The floor goes to Madam Harantsova from ALDE for a minute and a half. You have the floor, madam.
Una pregunta. ¿Dónde está la alta representante?
Where is the High Representative, the Vice President, this evening? Ms. Mogherini is not here to raise her voice and object to violations of human rights in Venezuela. In December, the European Parliament adopted a clear resolution on persecution of the democratic opposition in Venezuela. Quite frankly, I am amazed by the lack of respect shown by the High Representative. A year ago, Leopoldo Lopez was thrown in prison. Since then, we have seen further infringements of the rights of opposition members and students. Mr. Ledesma, the mayor of Caracas, has been imprisoned. Venezuelans are taking to the streets to say that enough is enough. The demands of the people have fallen on deaf ears amongst government forces. They're just trying to conceal their failures. We cannot lose or waste any more time. I would call on the Council to consider specific sanctions targeting government officials in the Maduro government. We must demonstrate that we stand shoulder to shoulder with the Venezuelan people in their fight for a democratic future. It is vital to this end that the European Union adopts a joint and strong position. We need immediate action. Thank you.
Dziękuję bardzo.
Thank you very much indeed.
Mr. Brock. Yes? Okay. Mr. Brok, please.
Frau Kollegin.
Madam colleague, I'd like to make a comment first and then put a question. Now, we've got an agreement with the High Representative. According to the Parliament's wishes, when she is actually represented by someone else or when she comes here herself. And today the Commissioner has spoken on her behalf, and that's actually in line with the agreement between the European Parliament and the High Representative Vice President of the Commission. So these kinds of attacks are simply not right, and I'd like you to take back what you said, please.
Thank you, Mr. Brok, for this explanation rather than the question. Do you want to answer?
With pleasure. As you said, there was no question, but I think that we've been discussing this issue for a while in this Parliament. I personally sent written questions to the High Representative, and so far I haven't seen any public press release from her part on the issue of Venezuela. But I'm looking forward to our next debate. Perhaps she will find time to come and discuss this issue with us. Thank you.
Thank you. Do zabrania głosu zapraszam panią poseł.
The floor goes to Ines Christine Zuber from GUE/NGL for 1 minute.
Thank you, President. We're also concerned by the course of events in Venezuela. In fact, on the 11th and 12th of February, a planned coup d'etat in Venezuela was dismantled on a model which reminds us of Chile in the 1970s. There was this Jericho plan, which would have involved murders to create chaos. Armed people would have come from outside. They were planning to assassinate the president and take over strategic points in the media to get across the coup position. Those involved in the plot have been arrested and they've been investigated for offences against national security. You're saying you want to make sure they're safe. Aren't Venezuelan people entitled to be safe?
Obrigado. Pan poseł Igor.
The floor goes to Mr. Soltaš from the Greens for 1.5 minutes.
Spoštovani gospod predsednik, spoštovani kolegi, hvala za.
Colleagues, thank you very much for having given me the floor. Each country and each people chooses the socio-economic order in which they want to live. This was the case for Venezuela as well. And in fact, until President Chavez came to power, we had 19 elections since he came to power, and in 18 cases it was always his party that won the elections. Now, the decision that was taken a long time ago regarding the socio-economic system in place in Venezuela is under threat. There's a clash between different types of values, different worlds, and the current situation bears out perfectly that conflict. We're receiving conflicting information about the situation. On the one hand, we need to accept and respect the choices made by the Venezuelan people. On the other hand, however, we do need to object to any infringements of human rights. But we need to look closely at the quality of the information we're receiving. Sometimes the information is very biased, so the role of the Parliament is to watch out for that.
Dziękuję.
Thank you very much indeed.
Gilles Labreton, non inscrit, 1 minute, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you, President. Antonio Ledesma, mayor of Caracas, has been in prison since 19th of February. He is accused by President Nicolás Maduro of organizing a coup d'etat. There is no credible evidence. Mr. Maduro and his entourage inherited a dictatorship from Mr. Chavez, and the country has plummeted into an economic crisis. He is looking to do away with a political enemy that might offer an alternative route. He has authorized the law and order forces to use deadly force against protesters. The coup in Venezuela is being orchestrated by Mr. Maduro. The European Union must condemn his action. Antonio Ledesma may have had a controversial track record, but at the end of the day, his fate is tightly linked to that of democracy in Venezuela.
Merci, député. Now, Deputy Davor Ivo Stier from EPP, 2 minutes, please.
Gracias, señor presidente. Suele decirse que cuando termina el carnaval se caen.
Thank you, President. You usually say that at the end of the carnival period, people drop their masks and you can see their real faces in the light of day. And that particularly applies in Venezuela. Last week, the carnival came to an end, not just in terms of the date on the calendar, but also this carnival of lies regarding the so-called Bolivarian revolution came to an end. This is supposed to be a model of democratic 21st century socialism. By jailing the mayor of Caracas, it became perfectly clear that Venezuela is not respecting political freedoms, individual freedoms. There is no democracy in Venezuela. True enough, President Maduro was elected in democratic elections, but there's more to democracy than just voting for a government. You also have to respect the opposition. You have to respect political and civil freedoms. And once a government starts reducing those freedoms and jailing opposition leaders, then that government turns itself into an authoritarian regime. That is why I'm saying that the masks have been dropped now. Nicolás Maduro's regime has very smoothly morphed into a dictatorship. In the homeland of Simón Bolívar, who is quite rightly regarded as one of the liberators of Latin America, sadly, what the Bolivarian camp are saying today actually runs counter to freedom. By jailing their opponents, Maduro is leaving Venezuela in the shadow of dictatorship and oppression, and in the shadow of poverty. For all these reasons, we need to send out a clear message from this Parliament. We have to say we've had enough of the authoritarian dictatorship of Nicolás Maduro.
Adesso, onorevole Nicola Caputo.
And now, Mr. Caputo, for 1.5 minutes. Go ahead. Thank you, President. With the resolution from last December, the European Parliament already showed that in Venezuela, the peaceful protests against Maduro had led to a disproportionate use of violence against the protesters by the police, by the National Guards and armed groups. Now, a year later in Venezuela, it's back to high tension. A 14-year-old boy, as we've heard, was killed by a firearm during a protest organised in San Cristobal. The news we're getting from Venezuela is very conflicting, however, and confused. Even if President Maduro has condemned the killings, all we can say, or we certainly can't say that this student is the first victim of a law enacted on the 30th of January where the services of law and order are now allowed to shoot. Now, as well as expressing our condolences to the family of the young boy, I think this Parliament has to do something more and flatly condemn the use of violence against protesters and the new decree of the Maduro government, which I personally considered to be unacceptable and deplorable. The EU and the Member States and the High Representative Mogherini have to use all instruments to urge the government in Venezuela to change tack and to have a constructive dialogue with the other political parties. I think a dialogue with all the political parties is what we need, and that's the only way forward to find a sustainable solution that improves the situation for the country. Thank you.
Grazie onorevole. Now, Deputy Beatriz Becerra Bastrecea. 1 minute, please.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Commissioner. In my country, in Spain and in Europe, if opposition leaders, if elected mayors were arbitrarily thrown into prison, if force were used to suppress protesters, if this were possible in Spain, in Europe, if the press, the media, journalists were suppressed and repressed, if human and civil political rights were infringed, this would be unacceptable. We cannot apply double standards. We cannot say that empty words are all we can offer Venezuela. Venezuela needs more. There are some 500,000 Venezuelan citizens in Europe. They are expecting us to take action. Thank you.
Gracias. Deputy Gabriel Mato from EPP, 2 minutes, please.
Gracias, presidente. Intervengo hoy ante ustedes.
Thank you, President. I'm speaking with the sorrow of knowing that a 14-year-old boy has died at the hands of the security forces of the Bolivarian camp, and the great people of Venezuela suffering from a government which is not respecting its own constitution and its international obligations. We can't be indifferent about this. It seems that indifference has taken over this Parliament and all the European institutions, though, in the light of what's been going on in Venezuela. In that country, thousands, indeed millions of citizens are having their freedoms confiscated simply because they disagree with the line of thinking or the actions of the government. Political leaders, public office holders have been arrested on trumped-up charges of their supposed intent to overthrow the government. We know that in Venezuela the dignity of many citizens is being undermined if they don't keep their heads beneath the parapet. There's no proper freedom of expression in Venezuela. Thousands of students around the world are suffering because the Venezuelan government is not sending them their grants. And young Venezuelans are dying for calling on the security forces who are supposed to protect them from repressing them. We must, but we just express our disgust in resolutions that have very little impact. The people of Venezuela are suffering and dying, and so the European Union must take decisive action to defend human rights and ensure that everyone in Venezuela can live in freedom, in decent living conditions. Let us show that the European Union does have a role to play in the world.
Muchas gracias. Now, Deputy Juan Fernando. I'm sorry, my mistake. Deputy Carlos Sorinho from Socialist Democrats Group. 1.5 minutes, please.
Thank you, President. Commissioner, the destruction of the middle classes has a brutal impact on the balance of societies and political in Venezuela. Doesn't leave room for fine-sounding thoughts, but there's a lesson here we can draw regarding the world today. The social divide in Venezuela is extremely serious. Rights, freedoms and guarantees have been undermined in an unacceptable fashion. It's increasingly necessary for there to be concerted, strong diplomatic action on the part of the international community. Venezuela has a constitution. When the Bolivarian regime came to power, although there were some criticism and suspicions regarding transparency, it did so via democratic elections. At a time of crisis, you have to do everything to ensure that the solution is also democratic, and so as to ensure that Venezuela's constitution is implemented. No solution outside that framework should be acceptable to the European Union or the international community. On both sides of a divided society, you can see totalitarian impulses. Those impulses must be fought equally forcefully, wherever they come from. The economic crisis, and in particular the impact of the collapse of oil prices on international markets, has greatly compounded the political crisis. And the political context has been made all the worse by the economic crisis, and that gives it a humanitarian crisis dimension. We are there to put out fires, not fan the flames, and the best way to do that is to make sure that Venezuela upholds the principles of the rule of law and apply legitimate pressure to make sure that the rules are respected by all the sides in the conflict.
Do you accept blue card from Deputy Castaldo? Onorevole Castaldo, prego.
Grazie.
Thank you very much for having accepted my question. I very much appreciated the balance in your words, and that's why I wanted to ask you, don't you think that our role as the EU is to be a mediator and alongside the other South American countries, not in an invasive way, but in a balanced way, to try to help the Venezuelan society? Thank you.
Senor Sorinho.
Thank you for your question, Honourable Member. Recently, I was actually in an international delegation to Latin America, and during the course of our visit, we heard people say every day that the democratic model and the rule of law in the European Union is a model for those countries to implement. We don't want to impose our model, but we can offer it as a reference point, taking an active, not a passive attitude. Thank you.
Now, Deputy Juan Fernando Lopez Aguilar from Socialist and Democrats Group. Please take the floor for 1.5 minutes.
Thank you, President. Like many here in the course of this debate, I have close and personal ties with Venezuela and am familiar with its recent history. I have a great deal of respect and affection for Venezuelans. I have direct knowledge of this country. There are at least 500,000 Venezuelan citizens here in Europe. Many of them are members of my own family, aunts and uncles. I have seen more than one election in Venezuela first-hand, and I am not quibbling with the legitimate nature of the electoral victories scored by Mr. Chavez and Mr. Maduro. Now, as a Democrat, as a constitutionalist, I believe that democracy requires respect for minorities, the sovereignty of the individual, the right position, as long as they express their views freely. And that is the problem. It must be possible for members of the opposition to express their disagreement. They should not face guns if they protest. They should not, protest should not result in a 14-year-old being gunned down. Leopoldo Lopez was arbitrarily thrown into a military jail. The mayor of Caracas, Mr. Ledesma, was also arbitrarily detained. We cannot allow the systematic use of arbitrary detention to tackle political opponents. That is unacceptable.
Senora Ana Gomes, Social Democrats Group, please.
Yet another young demonstrator has been killed, and the violent repression, the arrest of the elected Mayor of Caracas, Antonio Ledesma, in violation of the Constitution, will just compound the existing crisis in Venezuela, where there's a lack of basic commodities and corruption, systematic flouting of right of free expression and basic human rights. It's not enough to have elections and win a majority. To have a democracy, you have to respect the rules of the state based on the rule of law. And that's why Leopoldo López and all the other opposition leaders who have been imprisoned must be released. We must bring an end to this conspiratorial spiral in Venezuela. We need a dialogue bringing together Venezuelans in a process of transition. We need to send out a message to Venezuela, to the main players in the government, encourage a democratic solution, sticking to the planned timetable for the elections.
Señora Lidia Senra Rodriguez, GUE Angel Group.
Muchas gracias, presidente.
Thank you, President. I see very little balance here. We are not applying the same standards to Venezuela as to Ukraine and Palestine. The reason is, well, Venezuela does not want to play the capitalist game. It is defending its own resources. Some here would champion violence in defense of capital, but they are targeting Venezuela. Reform of the penal code or the criminal code in Spain will turn all activists into terrorists. Allow me to say that the death of the young teenager is being prosecuted in Venezuela.
Mr. Stelios Kologlou, please.
Κύριε Πρόεδρε, η κρίση πολιτική και κοινωνική της Βενεζουέλας.
The political and social crisis in Venezuela is due to the fact that for 15 years now the opposition hasn't accepted its defeats. It loses the elections and then tries to transform that into victory with coups and uprisings. It was the same previously after Chavez was overthrown, and at that time the Western governments didn't complain. In fact, some of them were very happy by the coup d'etat. So instead of believing the media again and again, in fact it was the media who'd organised the previous coup d'etat, it would be far better for the European Parliament to exert its influence and to try to convince the Venezuelan opposition that it needs to try to take power not through coup d'etat but via the ballot box, like in all democratic countries.
Evharisto. Now time for representative Commission. On behalf of High Representative, Commissioner Christos Stylianides. Take the floor, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, let me clarify that the High Representative has certainly expressed in public her concern on Mr. Ledesma's arrest. This is the statement that was released only yesterday. This is just to clarify this. And now, the European Union is keen to strengthen relations with Venezuela, both regionally and bilaterally. Our relations with Venezuela matter, and it is essential to be supportive as Venezuela faces the challenges previously outlined, whilst continuing to respond to events, encourage reform and appeal for genuine reconciliation in the country. It is in all our interest that real dialogue can take place both within Venezuela and also with Venezuela. We have a long shared history and close cultural ties with the country. We speak out of concern, friendship for Venezuela, when we say that the only way back to stability and progress in the nation is through inclusive dialogue. And inclusive dialogue is indeed the only way to reconciliation, provided that it's based on respect for human rights and, of course, freedom of expression. Thank you so much, Mr. President. Thank you for your attention.
Evcharisto, dziękuję bardzo panie komisarzu za czas nam poświęcony.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, for the time you devoted to us. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the debate. I close the debate. We will vote during the next session in March. And now we have another point in our agenda.